This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
For that welcome and that introduction. And I take seriously my role as a guinea pig, as it was described today. I realize this is a group that is probably varied as they come, and I hope that I can give a presentation that will be accessible to everybody here. And of course, I'll look forward to questions towards the end of the presentation. And I think I think the best thing to do with a big group like this, it's late in the afternoon, is get started with the darn talk. So, of course, the first thing you always do in a talk is acknowledge people that have contributed. And I'm just pointing out a few of these are my colleagues that are most recently I've been working with, in not by any means in my career, but these are the people who have been influential in most of the things that I'm going to talk about today, as well as the sources of support for that work. My talk is going to sort of work its way through several issues down into autism, if you will. We're going to start with some ways about thinking. I'm a developmental psychologist, by the way. I hope that was clear in Sally's. And so I think about development as a cumulative process, and you'll see how that works in my talk. And then we're going to talk about a very, very powerful variable in human development that we call maternal responsivity or parental responsivity, and the role it can play. And then we're going to get into the part of the talk that's really the new part, and maybe new for many of you. We're going to talk about a major advancement in behavioral sciences, the invention of a new type of measure, a new type of lens, kind of like for the first time inventing a microscope and getting a chance to look through that microscope and see things. And that microscope for this talk has been turned on to autism. And so we're going to talk about a study that is in press now in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities that reports the findings of this initial application of this measurement system. And then I'm going to end up, I'll just title the last part, Serendipity. There's nothing more pleasurable or fun in science than when you have an unexpected discovery. So that'll become at the very end, and I'll whet your appetites for that to hang in here. So the cumulative deficit hypothesis. This is an idea really that children with developmental disabilities, developmental delays, one of the challenges that they face and that we face with them is that over time their experience in life, growing up in the first few years of life and going forward, is one of steadily growing a deficit in terms of not just sometimes their skills and the way we talk about their skills, but their actual experiences. And that is part of how a developmental disability sort of works back upon itself at times. And so I'm going to talk about that first by letting you look at an old study now, just to make the point. There was a study done on the language experience of only typically developing children. No children in this slide had a developmental delay. In terms of the cumulative language experience that children experience during very early childhood, and how these were all typically developing children. This is a longitudinal study that was done at the University of Kansas in the actually done a study in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was published in a paper in Developmental Psychology, a professional journal in 1992, and then a book that I encourage you, if you really want to read an exciting and for anybody, I give this to undergraduates, a paper that describes forces that impact the development of children. The book Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children will be like reading a novel, an exciting one. And it reports the findings of their study with 42 typical children in this country. What was profound in their discovery with these 42 families and their young children was the differences in cumulative experiences that children had in terms of things that aid and support language development, language experience, and in some respects, social emotional development. Those differences were profound enough that they predicted how kids did in school years later. And this really, I think what was important about this study was that it sort of opened up something, a view that people had suspected but didn't have a clear picture of. And that's just how a cumulative effect can work over time in development. The differences between the kids in this study, you couldn't see in just watching a single period of interaction. They all were from intact homes. They all had caring parents. They all were typically developing children. Only if you looked at the experiences they were having cumulatively could you see how different those environments were and how differently that affected, it didn't change them from being atypical from typical development, but it really affected overall things in their development that were important. And so this led to really the same kind of thinking, naturally, that we might apply to children with developmental disabilities. I will mention to you one law of almost physics that came out of that Hart-Risley study, and that was something about parent talk. And the law is this: if a parent only talks a little to their child, any child, their initiations to the child are likely to be primarily directives. That is, they're oriented in their talk to managing the child's behavior. You need to do this, you need to pick that up, hand that to me, sit down, drink your milk, etc. All parents do that, and all parents do that roughly equally. What is different is this: if a parent talks a lot to their child, a lot more, most of that extra talk will be rich conversation and description and sort of discussion of what's going on and what the child's interested in and what just happened, and all this kind of talk that uses often a much broader vocabulary, much wider range of adjectives, and much more, all sorts of rich language that helps to build a broad base in vocabulary. So this is just one of the findings of their work that was really important and helped us begin to think about how environments can advantage or disadvantage any child. I got interested in the topic of maternal responsivity and maternal responsivity is the concept I'm now going to work into because it's really related to this construct of cumulative deficit. It's a little broader construct, and I was doing a study of the effects of early communication intervention with a colleague, Paul Yoder, in the early 1990s. And in this study, all the children received intervention directly provided to them by a therapist. The parents received no training, and they weren't part of the intervention. It was done in a preschool setting. But we did study the parents' behavior. We measured the construct of maternal responsivity, how responsive they were to their children, several times during the study. And we discovered in this study that the children who received one of the interventions and who also came from homes in which there was a high degree of maternal responsivity did much, much better than the other children in the study who had the same intervention and did not come from a home with a high degree of this thing called maternal responsivity. The metaphor I use is that in the intervention we planted a seed. We planted a seed. We worked with the children 20 or 30 minutes a day, several days a week. Not very much time. They then went home to an environment that either watered that seed and provided the nourishment that it needed to grow, or they didn't. Not to a bad situation, just to a situation in which the nourishment that seed, in terms of the skills that we taught, weren't supported in ways that allowed those to grow. That led to a very strong finding in our research of a sort of differential effect that was done by parents who had received no training, no intervention. It was simply the difference in normal parenting. So that intrigued me, and that's really what led me to where this talk is going to go tonight. So maternal responsivity, what is that exactly? This is, I think, I hope a definition that everyone can appreciate. It's healthy, growth-producing relationship with such characteristics as warmth and nutrients and stability for the child and predictability for children about how their environments work and what the rules are and how they're going to be treated. And then it's something else, and that's called contingent responsiveness. That means that when a child says something like, is looking around and they want to find something and there's a cup of water they want to drink, maybe they reach for it and their mom goes, oh, you want the water, here's the water. And it means that literally turn by turn, the child initiates, the adult responds, the child initiates, the adult responds. There are these conversations, and in these conversations that occur all day long at all sorts of weird times, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, however many there are, the child is getting this very explicit sort of feedback. Nobody's thinking about this or trying to construct this, but that feedback is teaching them about the world, what things are named, how things are worked, and they're in response to the child's initiations, okay, or things that the child is showing interest in. So that contingent responsiveness turns out to be where the great power of maternal responsivity resides. So you could be a really nice, warm, nurturing parent, but not engage in a lot of contingent responsiveness, those conversations and dialogues with your child, and probably your child won't receive that extra boost that maternal responsivity can make. Now, that's basically the definition. You'll see variations on that in the literature. Why does it matter? So there is a very large scientific literature on this thing called maternal responsivity. Sometimes it's called other things, but it all reflects to parenting style, basically. And that literature is associated with, shows that high maternal responsivity, lots of this kind of turn-taking interaction with children throughout the day by not just parents, but caretakers, teachers. We're talking about young kids, remember, developmentally at least. Leads to enhanced cognitive development, enhanced language development, enhanced social skills, and as I pointed out in an example of the study I was involved in, can lead to better effects of early intervention for kids who do have issues. So it does matter. And so this topic became of greater interest to me because of the effects I saw in my own language intervention research and the work I did with Paul Yoder, and it led me to begin to study this variable called maternal responsivity in a group of families who have Fragile X syndrome. Now, as many of you know, Fragile X syndrome is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is associated with autism. Roughly, depends on the study you look at, somewhere from 20 to 35% of children, mostly males, who have Fragile X syndrome will end up being diagnosed with some stability on the autism spectrum. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that I know many people study here at the Mind Institute and can teach us a lot about autism. It's also a particularly interesting sort of disorder to really examine maternal responsivity in, because maternal responsivity, first of all, potentially may moderate the effects of Fragile X on child development. That is, children who have Fragile X disorder and who come from situations in which cumulatively they receive a very rich, high degree of maternal responsivity, those kids may have higher cognitive levels of development, higher language development, other markers that may be better than on average they might be without that. That's our hypothesis that we want to test, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the downside, maternal responsivity may be impacted by some aspects of the mother's behavior. If the mother, of course, is a carrier, the biological mother of Fragile X, there may be greater depression, anxiety. There could be effects on cognitive level of the mother. It may be more difficult for that mother to parent the child in a highly responsive way, consistently at least, on a regular basis. And then, of course, the child's impact itself. It's very difficult to be highly responsive in the way I just described with a child who is very difficult to interact with. We all know that. So this if it were otherwise, if maternal responsivity could be done with any kind of kid at some high and easy level, relatively easy, then we and would have a big impact on behavior, then we'd see actually probably a lot less autism and things like that, that somehow the parenting would be, so good that it wouldn't occur. We don't see that. We know that. So we know that, we all know this from our own experiences, that parenting a child with a significant developmental disorder, particularly something like Fragile X or autism, make it a real struggle to maintain a relationship like this in a way. Perhaps not impossible, but very hard. So we were motivated to look at the role of maternal responsivity in these families, and whether in fact it did have an impact, a positive impact on the development of these children. Like it has been shown to have with typically developing children and children with some other disorders. And so my colleagues and I at the University of Kansas have been conducting a longitudinal study of 55 families of children with Fragile X. These are all biological families. The mother is the carrier in all cases. 3 of the families, interesting, the mother is full mutation Fragile X, which means they really have the disorder themselves fully. And these families have now stayed with us 7 years, from the time their child was very young until we're now moving into middle childhood. And we're studying this. And we have a paper. This is a longitudinal study, so all the researchers in this audience who study behavior know that you do these studies for a long time before you find interesting results, usually, because it takes a while to accumulate the data. And that's been the case in this study. We have our first major paper out of this data now in press in the American Journal of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And what we discovered in our study was that indeed there were some impacts of maternal responsivity that I think are very important. So I'll give you just one example. I'm not going to walk through all of this, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that yes, parenting does matter with children, and we really need to look carefully at these things in families who have a child with a developmental disability. So on this slide, I'm just going to give this one example, but the findings our report hold for all of the measures we looked at. We were looking at, and those measures were receptive language, which we're going to look at here, receptive language development, expressive language development. These were both measured by what I would call a distal measure, which means a test, in this case the Mullen. And it was a test of, that was done totally separate from our research by somebody who didn't even know what was really going on. So they just did the test best they could. And then we had some proximal measures. These were measures that were taken of the child's behavior actually when they interacted with the parent. Those were things like how often the child initiated and spoke, how often the parent spoke, some things like that. And what we found was that children with Fragile X who had, first I have to tell you, make sure everybody, the CARS is sort of a behavioral indice or behavioral measure that's associated with autism symptoms. It's been around for a very long time, and it's not used for diagnostic work, although I think it used to be at times. It's not the gold standard measure for autism, but we used it in this study because we could take the measure at the same time that we collected the data on the families interacting with their child. All the data was always taken in their home, by the way. We traveled all over the country to get the data. So it was all done in their home, and every time we went, we did the CARS, and we got a score from the CARS. And so we got, I won't say it's a measure of autism. I would say it was a measure of autism symptoms during the time that we were collecting the data in the home. And so we used that measure both as a control in our study and as a something to compare and look for how autism might have been playing an impact in terms of what our families were able to do. And in this slide, what we're showing is that on a measure of the predicted Mullen receptive language raw score, that's a big mouthful, don't worry about that too much, the children who had the most responsive parents, okay, and a relatively low score in the CARS, they were not in the autism range on that, they did the best, okay? And the children who had a low CARS scores and low responsivity, the parents really weren't very responsive. They were good parents, but they didn't do too well on this measure. They did not as well as the high responsivity parents did in terms of the kids' performance on this measure. But you know what? They still did a lot better than the kids who had highly responsive parents, but their child also was in the autism rating area. So I think we saw this pattern right here where maternal responsivity did have an impact, but where it could not, in a sense, mitigate the effects of autism consistently on all the measures that we took. And all of these measures were different statistically. So the takeaway message from this study for us of Fragile X is that, boy, we were pleased to see that early maternal responsivity, this was our first measures when the kids were really young, they predicted 4 different important language outcomes. I gave you just an example of one. At 36 months of age, controlling for child developmental level and autism. That's a pretty strong effect. That means that we weren't just seeing probably a simple correlation of maternal responsivity that was really affected a lot by the child's autism or developmental level. But we also saw that that high maternal responsivity, although it did have offset the impact of autism a little, it didn't have that big of impact on it. I think that shows the challenge that we are all up against when we think about parenting with children with autism, if we were trying to provide them the most optimal kind of environment. I think that's really the takeaway message. So this brings us to Lena. Now, I have to admit that I have a daughter named Lena. That's not the Lena I'm going to talk about. This is my daughter, Lena, when she was cute and lovable. She's now a 19-year-old sophomore at the University of Maryland. And she calls me, as you would expect, only if there's a problem. So I'm always happy when I don't hear from her. It means things are really going great. All of you understand that situation. So I don't mean this Lena. I do mean a Lena. That Lena in this case stands for Language Environment Analysis. And, but Lena is, for short, works really well. And the purpose of this new tool was to provide scientists and clinicians and parents with automatically generated information about a child's natural language environment and language development. So this is a new kind of tool, not one that's actually ever been, this particular type of tool has never been seen on the face of this planet. That's how new it is. What Lena is first of all, it's a system, obviously, and that system is made up of first a digital language processor, which basically means a very small tape recorder. That little tape recorder is about the size of a little memory stick that you might stick in your computer. It's very small. It weighs just over 2 ounces, and it has a really great battery in it that lets it operate for about 16 hours at a time. And that little tape recorder, you slip it into, you got to wear some clothing called the Lena clothing. The clothing's important because this thing has an extremely sensitive microphone on it that was developed by some military defense contractor in the Bay Area for the CIA, seriously. But hey, they come up with things we can use too. And so that little tape recorder fits in a little pocket that and it's sensitive to, really sensitive to acoustic signals. So the clothing, you can't put anything on a kid, it'll muffle it. You have to put on something, some clothing that comes along with it. It'll take 16 hours of audio data. And then you take the little Lena thing, the little digital processor, and you plug it, you port it into a computer. And there's, inside that computer, if you're doing this at home, or for more advanced analyses at the research center that does this work in Boulder, Colorado, is advanced speech, some algorithms for analyzing that speech. These algorithms, these formulas, are what the real invention is here. They're the real intellectual property, the real breakthrough, because they allow us to do some things with language that we've never been able to do, and do them automatically. And what they let us do, these algorithms take if you want to, later on I'll be glad to explain the physics of this, but everything that all the speech you're hearing right now, this is simply a physical process. It's governed by laws of physics. The acoustic signals that all of us are listening to when we speak and are producing operate very lawfully and in very predictable ways. And human speech is very predictable to operate in certain patterns. This is all old knowledge. But what these algorithms do is they go through that human speech signal that gets collected by the digital processor, and they identify the word units, not the words themselves. It doesn't understand words. It understands the frequencies of words. And it knows what words look like in frequencies. It knows what it can do. You'll see, I'm going to go through what it can do. But it does all of this stuff And it doesn't know what it's listening to, except it knows the difference between the sounds it's hearing and a dog barking or a TV in the background. That took 2 or 3 years to figure that one out, how to screen, and that it can tell the gender of a speaker, it's a male or female, and it does a very good job of recording everything that comes out of the child's mouth and everything that is said to the child in a range of about 4 to 6 feet. Outside of 6 feet, it's hearing it, but it doesn't. We don't want it to actually say that that's interaction with the child, and so it throws it over into a corner in the analysis system. And it also does a very good job of localizing what it would be a conversation. I said this, you said that. I said this, you said that. And so that allows it to do lots of things. I'm not going to talk about all the things it does today, but it allows us to estimate the number of adult words that a child hears per day or per hour in very explicit ways. It allows us to identify child vocalizations that are unique vocalizations by the child. And I think as most important, it allows us to measure conversational turns. I did this, you did this, I did this, you did this. I think that's actually its most powerful measure. It does other things, as I said, but that's enough for today. It gives you printouts. It shows you what the kid was saying at what time of day, how much they were talking. It tells you things like you can tell they're sleeping. You can tell all those sorts of things. It gives you child vocalization rates, again, broken up however you want to. It gives you conversational turns, the same thing. And so it's a pretty powerful tool. If you want to, the real data, that is the actual speech, is always available. You can drill down to it in the system and say, I want to know, okay, this is all great, but I don't believe it. I want to listen to an hour of that tape recording to see if it matches up to what you told me were the number of words, number of number of adult vocalizations, child vocalizations, turns, etc. So the system is highly reliable. Let me just say that, and that's of course very important. The system has been studied at this point and applied with a large number of typically developing children, so that we could get a normative picture of what it thinks normal development would be, what Lena thinks normal development would be. So this study, this is important because we're going to measure everything against that normal database and see how things compare to that. And so the study I'm just summarizing was of 329 families in the Denver, Colorado area. They were studied from 2 months of age, kids were, to 36 months of age. You can see the breakdowns. They were all typically developing children. All the children, in addition to participating in the study, a speech pathologist came and visited them and did an assessment to make sure they were not language delayed, understand that we really knew what we were looking at. And they were selected to match the U.S. population as tightly as possible. So you can see here the U.S. Census in terms of education breakdown of mother's education status, one of the best measures of language development, environment a child will be raised in, is the educational level attained by the mother. And you can see that on this particular variable and others, we really matched, the Lena project matched pretty closely U.S. Census. So it was, we thought, a pretty good representative view of the United States with this measure. That normative study took about, as I mentioned, each child was in it for about 6 months. Once a month for 6 months, the recorder was given to them. They ran it for 12 hours at a time. They were given a specific schedule by which they were to use the recorder, so that we made sure we didn't record all weekend days, all Sundays, all Wednesdays, something that the parent would say, I want to do this schedule because it's easy for me. What we wanted them to do was we wanted to make sure there was a sample going on across the period of time, and we weren't getting a bias in our data because we were getting all weekends or all Mondays or Saturdays or whatever. So this has contributed data to a norming study, and enormous amounts of things were learned from this initial study about human language that were actually unknown at that point. Last thing, the parents never saw the data. They just took this little device, this little thing, and they stuck it in a FedEx thing and mailed it off every day. They never had any feedback. We didn't want them to be influenced by the device. I guarantee you that if you wear one of these things, your child wears it, you may be aware of it for a short period of time, and then you won't. I tried this out with a speech-language pathology doctoral student who was working with me. This is an extremely knowledgeable person about language development's importance. sent it home with her to use a few times. She came back the next week all but in tears because she had discovered that on a weekend day that she thought had been pretty good with her kid. Her data rated her at the 12th percentile lowest in the United States in terms of interaction with her child. And it was right. And so, in fact, the norms that were predicted, you don't have to read through this, but this thing was really a tool of discovery, and it changed the Hart and Risley studies results, which were done by hand and took 10 years to analyze and code. This thing replicated in 6 months. It found a slightly different picture, and it explained a lot of the mysteries of the Hart and Risley data. For example, Hart and Risley's predicted, based on on children in their study that performed optimally and who received the most parent-child impact, that a parent who really wanted their kid to be a superstar in language development would have to produce about 25 to 30,000 utterances a day to their child. So if you wanted to replicate, you wanted to be at the best end of the Hart and Risley, you would go and talk that much to your kid. This study discovered a flaw, a previously undiagnosed flaw in the Hart and Risley study. All the data in the Hart and Risley study was collected late afternoons, generally speaking, and then they overgeneralized. They extrapolated from that data and said, this is representative, we think, of the experiences of these children. And in one way they were right, but they were totally wrong on the numbers, because it turned out, and it was discovered in this study, that the most common time for parents to interact and talk with their children is late afternoons. And if in this analysis, we could totally exactly replicate Hart and Risley if we only looked at the data for that little narrow range of time that they had looked at. But if we actually looked at the whole day, it was a different picture. Very good parents talked much less, much to their relief. And the sort of range of behavior and overlap between different groups based on mother education, things like that, became a little more complicated. I won't go into those details, but they did, basic results of the Hart and Risley were replicated, that talking more to your children does make a difference in terms of how as it relates to language outcomes and language scores, at least in the short term. But a more complicated picture, I won't go into the details. They discovered, as I mentioned, that Hart and Risley substantially overestimated the total amount of adult and child talk that occurred. Some other findings, they found that across the board, parents believe they talk far more to their children than they actually do. All parents reported that at all education levels, by the way. They did something that we all thought was probably true is mothers talk more to their daughters, and they talk more to their firstborn children than later-born children. Most talk occurs in the later afternoons and early evenings compared to other times. Surprise, surprise, there is a negative correlation between television and language ability scores. So the more TV, the less, but that actually is an effect that's been published already in the archives of pediatric psychology, I believe, just recently, that study that came from this database. And it wasn't that parents didn't talk a lot to their kids when the TV wasn't on. They did. When you we them when their TV wasn't on, they were pretty good. It's just that the TV shut down things and was on a lot in terms of interaction. We also saw in this study just an enormous amount of day-to-day variability in parent talk to children. So parents would, in general, could be all over the place, have good days. They had good days and they had bad days. So I could go into more on that, but it's just sort of the background for, now let's look at kids with autism. So this really gets us back finally to the title of the paper, the presentation. You're probably wondering if I was ever going to get to this. I am. And I'm going to report the results, not all the results, but some selected results from a paper that I'm the principal author of that was just accepted for publication in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities. And you can see what the title is. I'm not sure this is the most accurate title, but I guess I have till next Wednesday to decide if it is or not, I've been told. Anyway, about this study. This study was done of 26 children with autism. I will say that they were selected from a group of 123 families from around the United States that volunteered to be in the study. And we selected a small subsample though because we could get the best indication of the actual diagnosis that the kid had, that there were various other criteria that met, and we make sure we were doing our best job of recruiting and creating a sample that we felt, even though it was small, and it was not a random or population study or anything like that. It's what would be called a sample of convenience. It would generally reflect children who are identified with autism fairly young. The ages ranged from 16 to 48 months. There were 22 males and 4 females. We recruited to families from all over the country. And we were basically trying to create a group of relatively low-functioning children with autism who might be described often by people as having classic autism. They were younger kids, so we weren't picking up kids who had Asperger's or a lot of more relatively minor versions of autism, serious though they may be. And because it was a sample of convenience, the demographic distribution was skewed towards families with higher education status. These families were matched from that normal study I just described with 329 families. From that study, we picked 78 families that basically matched up and created a matched comparison group for this family. So the match was an age-level match. It's not a developmental match. And that's a small but important issue to keep in mind. The participants then in our study, you can see that they were, almost 70%, over 70% of them had some college, 58% had college, 4 years of college or beyond. And so you can see that compared to the U.S. Census, again, my point, it was a pretty skewed sample overall towards relatively well educated families, not unlike families you often find out on the internet, volunteering to be in studies, willing to do things, and that's what we got, that group. These families agreed to be in a 7-week study with 8 recordings, 1 recording week for 7 weeks, and twice they were recorded the first week. Again, just like in the normative study, there was no feedback to them. They just simply were sent the little Lena digital recorder. They sent it back in overnight mail the next day. We did that on purpose because you don't want to give people feedback that might bias their behavior. And they were given, again, a very strict schedule to balance out the days that they took the data on this. We paid them. We also asked them to fill out a lot of questionnaires. The recording procedures, I won't go over them, but they were very similar to what we had done with the normative sample, almost identical, essentially. And we also sent them, they sent us literally their file, if you will, of the diagnostic information that they had access to on their child. We did not do a separate ADOS or some separate analysis. We were not in a position to do that, and we didn't feel that that was necessary. In addition to that, though, we had them complete a bunch of questionnaires that basically give you a pretty good view from a parent's perspective about where their child fits on the autism continuum, how their communication and language development is doing, how their behavior in general is doing, and how their child looks to them based on these kinds of measures. So the sample, again, I mentioned it was matched, and we balanced for age. We balanced the education. We took from our sample of the 329 families, those families that matched that education status. So we did everything we could to make a matched sample, which is not exactly the most pristine way to do a study like this, but I think it was the best we could do in this case. So now to some selected data. So we'll start with how much the parents talk to their children. How many adult utterances directed to the child did the Lena technology pick up? And actually, there's some good news here in the sense that this is not a statistically significant difference right here. Then it demonstrates that these parents were trying to talk to their kids a lot. Not quite as high as the typically developing families, but this is a difference. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but it wasn't statistically significant. Maybe if we did a much more bigger study with a lot more parents, maybe it would have been a lot more families. So, but I think fairly good news. Now, in terms of how much the children with autism vocalized, they did vocalize a lot less than the typically developing kids. And that was statistically significant. It looks, as it kind of looks on this, you can see the difference here. It's visually pretty big, and you'll see, I'll show you some summary statistics. It adds up to be pretty big as well. I will also say this, I'm not going to show you data on this, but we had data on how much the children talked in what we called monologues, where they weren't talking to anybody. Okay, well, I can see all these heads shaking right here. the kids with autism scored very high on monologues, almost the opposite of the typically developing kids. So they were off, and whoever they were talking to, they weren't interacting with the adult, and that was a profound difference that we observed. I didn't include that graph here, but all these head shakers, that is what you saw, those kind of monologues going on. And then here's of course what I think is one of the really important measures, how much they engaged in these conversations. My turn, your turn, my turn, your turn. And these were, again, statistically significant, quite a bit less than the typically developing matched normative sample. So those were some important differences. I will also, this is just an aside in some ways, but it's important, shows I think something about the validity of our measures, is that we did find, as it's always found in all studies pretty much of maternal responsivity, that the higher SES, higher education level families did tend to talk more to their kids with autism. So that same phenomenon you see in typical development, you see that also in our sample of kids with, of families with kids with autism. Same replication. Now here's one that I think you'll find really interesting. This is, we were able, well, I think it was 14 of our families had children who were in treatment programs, and during the time they were in treatment programs, the Lena was on. And they kept these little things where they told us what went on during the day, little brief sort of summaries of what happened that day, just so we could sort of tell where the kid had gone, because although the kids probably had these on in the house more often, they went out in the world, they went to classrooms, they went to those things, whatever they did. And on this slide, this is for a single child. We're going to look at one child, okay? And we're just looking at adult word counts, at just that particular measure for this child on 2 days. This is a day when the child has some therapy time, and these are the periods in therapy, right there, right? And this is a day when the kid has no therapy. Okay, we saw this pattern across all the kids who were in therapy. First of all, these were rich islands of talking and communication, all right, that went on in these periods here. And you can see, you know, hey, the kid was asleep here and the kid slept here too, but this looks pretty impoverished compared to that, okay? And our data is very clear on it that it was relatively impoverished. So when let's bring this back just to make a comment on what might, when we think about intervention with children and when they're in these intervention sessions, maybe as much as anything what they're getting is a period of time that's very rich in terms of language and social interaction, somebody talking with them and interacting with them. And then they spend much of the rest of the day maybe in situations where they're on their monologues or they're doing whatever they're doing, and it's not the same. And maybe that's part of the real secret in the 25 hours, right? In the getting your kid in a program where they're spending, whatever the type of the program, it's simply a program in which there's a huge amount of, or relative interaction, is that during that period of time, you're really driving up the amount of time that they spend in these kind of interactions in which language is built for typically developing kids. I'm just speculating on that, but I think that this shows you one of the ways, and there are many ways that this Lena device can be used, and many implications it may have for intervention. So I want to come back to those cumulative impacts that you saw, though. You didn't see cumulative, you saw one-day average differences. But let's play, remember, I'm a developmental psychologist. I like to think how things happen cumulatively over time. And I believe that your experience over time does make a difference, okay? So I'm going to play a game that some people wouldn't play, but I will. And that is, that let's assume that adult word count, remember, wasn't different statistically. That is, parents with kids with autism did talk to their children a lot, and just a little less than typically developing children. But, you know, that would still be, it was about 1,000 less adult words a day that their kids were getting on average. That'd be 7,000 per week. And so over 3 years, which is important, 3 years is a big important kind of variable when you think about language development or span of time. That would be 1 million fewer adult vocalizations if that's an accurate estimate of what they were getting. Sounds like a lot to me. Maybe it's not, but it sounds that way to me. If we looked at the child vocalizations themselves, how much they were talking, the children with autism produced 700 fewer vocalizations a day. That was statistically significant difference from the typically developing match kids. Almost 5,000 less per week. or 765,000 fewer child vocalizations emitted in a 3-year period. And then finally, this variable of conversational turns. They engaged in 150 fewer turns in a day, about 1,000, just over 1,000 a week, or 164,000 fewer across 3 years. So I think, I don't think this explains in any way, I don't want to make an implication that this has any explanation in terms of autism or autism status, or whether you have severe autism or mild autism or anything, but I think what it does say is that this is part of the struggle that we all have when we're working with kids with autism, is that we're battling something that's accumulating as well in terms of experience the child has in the environment. And it's when people say sometimes, well, you know, autism can beget autism. This is an example of how that process could work as a sort of cumulative process. So sort of the impact of intervention on the language learning environment. Just come back to that one point that I made in the one graph then. That when we think about intervention time, and we really need to study this, it's that rich island of language and social interaction in what might otherwise be viewed as an impoverished learning environment for these kids that really may be the driver for kids in general about why that seems to be so effective for some kids, have such a big impact. And finally, the automated measurement that we used here, you know, really automatic, very inexpensive to do, impossible to do by human hands in anything other than 10 or 20 years of data coding, may be a very useful tool in measuring, for example, the fidelity of interventions and how well they're working and how well parents who are trained in programs are continuing to provide the kind of environment that they're trained to do, or the way that teachers are. We could go on down that list of potential implications. So I'm going to bring you to the last piece of my talk, and then we can open it up. I love the concept of serendipity because it refers to something that is a rare event that happens that cannot be predicted, in which discoveries are made, and people go, oh my goodness, look at this. What is this all about? And we are, I'm going to talk about some unpublished data that's in review right now in a major, one of the major science journals in the world. I don't know that they're going to publish it. I'm just telling you they're reviewing it. But it is of this discovery. And that discovery, it was the identification of autism in early childhood by automated vocal analysis. Now, it's not the diagnosis of autism by automated vocal analysis. The study was led by Kim Aller, a person, by the way, who has studied autism, not a lot. He studied early, he's an expert on vocal development in humans. He's published with Peter Mundy, who's now here at the Mind Institute before, and a long list of colleagues. I won't go into them except to say each of us had our unique, and in my case, small contribution to this. But this is a study that is in review, and I'm positive will be published. It's simply how soon it will be out. But basically, here's what the study, remember, Lena is hearing vocal energy, vocal production. Basically, it doesn't hear language per se, but it hears what we produce as humans in terms of a stream of energy. And there's actually a long literature on the basic research, really, that indicates that many children with autism have unique vocal characteristics. Many parents will tell you that their child has some unique vocal characteristics. This literature has always been, the studies that have tried to look at this, they're hard to do. They're done with small samples. They're tedious, and nobody knew. We knew there was some differences there, but we didn't have a good enough way to measure these things, and so no one knew what the clinical utility of these were. And in fact, this particular difference in children with autism is not listed in the core deficits ever that I know of that are associated with autism in various screeners. But remember, we had collected this group of children with autism. We had taken our new measurement thing, we'd looked at that language learning environment, and then Kim Aller said, let's look at their vocal patterns. Let's just see what they're like. Okay, we can do it. This thing measures that better than it measures anything. Those were measured, and then in this study, we take the measures of their vocal patterns. We automatically collected. We compare them to a large number of typically developing children's vocal patterns automatically collected, and a large number of children with language delay, whose who had not autism but had language delay, data was also collected by this. And basically, the task, I won't go how we did it exactly, but the task is, it's all described in the paper. The task was to see whether you could automatically identify the children who had an autism vocal pattern from the other kids who had language delay and the kids who were typically developing. Just pick that out automatically, no human invention. And the system picks out reliably that 90% of the children with autism based on their vocal pattern alone. It differentiates those from the kids with language delay, and it differentiates those from the typically developing kids. 90%. It makes some errors, okay? So the possibility here is that what we may have discovered is an automatic universal screen for autism that could be done in any language in the world. There's no clinical judgment involved. A parent comes into to a school or clinic, they say, we're doing an autism screen in the community. You don't have to do anything. Take this little tape recorder home. We got a shirt for your kid. Put this on him, turn it on, bring it back tomorrow. And it turns out there's any issue there, then there would be an opportunity for the parent to come in and have a diagnostic thing done. Let's do a diagnosis. Let's see if there's a real issue. That could be done again. This thing doesn't care if it's English, Spanish, Chinese. There could be some languages that stump it occasionally, and it's sitting there going, "What the heck is that? I didn't know that was a human vocal sound." But in theory, any language it'll work in, and could be done, as you can see, relatively inexpensively, and basically could lead. We don't know. Now, I will point out this is one study. It wasn't used as a screener. These kids, the kids in the sample who had picked out. We already knew they had autism, and it hasn't been applied to kids younger than 24 months. So I don't want to overstate what this finding at this point. It's got a long ways to go, and any scientist knows that the first thing you do with a finding the first time it's reported is to be highly skeptical of it, which we all should be. We'll see. So we'll see how this plays out, but it could be, in fact, a very important advancement for all of us around the world. Time will tell. So my final thoughts, and I'll open for questions. I think this is what is really the takeaway from this. Rapid scientific advances occur following major breakthroughs in measurement. That's universally true about science. Science advances usually on the breakthroughs in measurement most rapidly. The telescope, the microscope, we all know those, right? Those were new measures, new lenses. They changed our view of the world. The big world above us, the little world below us, our place in the universe, etc. In the neurosciences, in the genomic sciences, there have been extraordinary advancements in the last 30 to 40 years in the science, and both those are all done by breakthroughs in measurement. Okay? In the behavioral sciences, we have nothing analogous to this. We've made no such breakthroughs. In fact, the system for collecting the data I just described before, Lena, was a tape recorder and laborious hours of a person inaccurately trying to characterize something like vocalizations. This is a measurement breakthrough. I don't know all. I can tell you what I think some implications may be someday, but it will change, I think, some things in this world. It's not going to revolutionize autism. It's not. There's a lot of things that it has lots of limitations. It has lots of things it will not do, but I think it will have real value in the world of autism and beyond. That's my prediction. So I don't really care for pessimists. I love skeptics, and I always like what Helen Keller said about all of this. And so this is the end of my formal presentation. I'm open to questions now, and I'm also willing, if you can email me sometime if you want to. Also, I could, when some of the papers available of reporting this stuff up, both of these studies, the study that's in press in the Journal of Autism Development, and when we get an accepted publication of the study I just described, I'd be glad to send these to people when we get to those points. Or you could learn more about this technology from the Lena Foundation in Boulder by just Google Lena Baby or Lena Foundation or any of those things. You'll find out about them. So I just want to open up for questions. I know I'm at 5:28, so I used all my time, but.
Very much, Steve. And let's open the floor to questions. And discussion points. Who would like to begin? Okay, so let's see a hand or a comment. Okay.
I was wondering if you saw differences in the children on the therapy days or after therapy. So did those increases in the number of words that they heard, did that translate also into an increase in number of words, I guess, during therapy and then carrying out throughout the day?
So that's a very good question. What we did see in the data is there is an afterglow of being in the therapy sessions. So for a period of time after kids come out of those sessions, based on these measures, they talk more and there's more interaction. So there is an after effect that seems to be there for an hour or two.
Did the moms also? Because in that particular chart, it looked
They
like
didn't
they
show
were
it, but in the
spiking.
particular chart, you see the interaction with both. Yeah, it's not just the kid. Yeah.
What did the Lena device actually measure that differentiated children with autism from typically developing kids and kids with language delay? Okay,
very good question. So I am not I have to say immediately, I am not a speech scientist. That is, I don't study the acoustics and the physical properties of speech. I'm a language guy. So I only know what I've been told. But basically, our language system, this is all just physics here. It's all the expression of energy, okay? And it's very easy, relatively easy, with a sensitive enough device to measure very specific aspects of that energy exposure, how long a segment of energy goes, how high it goes, if you want to think about it that way, its patterns and things like that. And there are a finite number of ways, it turns out, that those things can be expressed. There are certain numbers of acoustical properties that are common in human speech. And you can then, what you can do is you can apply a map to that energy that lets you, that you would predict based on normal development, you would see expression of energy occur in. I hope I'm describing this. When you, and this is well known in speech sciences. There's a whole huge literature on speech science that I'm now summarizing badly. And so we know what the normal patterns of these things should be, okay? And we could take this device and look at kids' data collected, the normative sample, and see whether it can, it fit the normal models that were already known, okay? It does, okay? We can take the kids with autism, we can put them in and put them in the same predictive thing and say, here's the predictions, and it doesn't match. It doesn't match at all. And that's fundamentally what it's doing. It's seeing, and the paper itself goes into much more of the sort of physics and exactly how that looked, and is beyond my level to explain to you in a comprehensive, reasonable way that you and I would both understand, at least me. Yeah.
In terms of screening with Lena, it seems like a logical place to study maybe with the infant SIB studies, such as the MARBLE studies going on here at the Mind.
Yeah, I think that's, the Lena device is designed to be used with infants on up, okay? So it's really, most of the research has occurred from infants to 48 months so far. And so it could be used in a study like that. And as I mentioned, you know, one of the things about the study I just reported on is the youngest child, I think, was 24 months or something like that. We haven't, and this is, I mean, a huge question. We have no idea whether this thing would help us pick up younger kids routinely. And that's a big and important scientific question. The other point I would make about this is we are just on the edge of using this tool. The only studies that are going to be in the literature are people like me who had access to this because I was on the scientific advisory board when it was being developed. And the tools out there, and the goal of Lena Foundation right now is actually for scientists to take this thing and do what scientists do. Invent, clinicians as well, invent applications, test applications, let's find the flaws. They'll invest to make this thing better and to fix the flaws as we find it and do what they can about the limitations. And so I think that's how a tool gets better and gets better focus. And I'm convinced that 90% of accuracy could potentially be improved just by improvements in this system. I don't know if it can, at some point you get to the edge of what you can do, but I don't know that they're there yet. So, yes?
You partly answered that already, but I was wondering in adult psychiatry, or especially in older children, possibly ADHD or schizophrenia onset, could it be used as a diagnostic tool?
I think it's a wonderful question. Why don't you study it? Nobody's studying these things. I mean, I think this tool has applications across the ages. So my mother lives in a place in Lawrence, Kansas, that with a lot of other elderly people, and it's a really great place, I believe. I'm just simply saying that this is a mechanism. If my mother was in 24-hour care part of the facility, and I wanted to know how rich that environment was, as opposed in what she was experiencing in her day. I mean, ultimately, this same measurement tool could be used in that and perhaps all kinds of other settings. It's just a new measurement tool. It's our job now to figure out how to use it in what settings with what kind of populations to learn what we can from it. I think what it measures, it doesn't measure all that many different things. So another part of what's important here is the extent to which those measures themselves turn out to be proxies for broader processes. And they're basically, it's measuring one aspect of a process, doing it really well, and it's tapping down into a whole range of other things that are part of that process. And we don't really know if that's true or not. We know that these variables that it measures well were the same ones that Hart and Risley looked at, but they're really pretty crude. And we, at this point, we don't, there's just tons of rich questions to do here with this. We haven't used this to monitor interventions, to guide interventions, to monitor, to assure fidelity of treatment for years afterwards in studies that are done. We base that on rare visits to homes to see what's going on, or schools or whatever. I mean, I think the potential applications of an automatic system that measures these things, I mean, I don't know what I'm sure there are plenty of limits. I don't doubt there are many, but at this point, we don't know what the limits are.
I have a question, Steve. How do you deal with the confidentiality issues of a device that the people interacting with the child can't see the device, they're in and out?
Yeah.
How do,
well, this will be an interesting issue for IRBs. In the research, the way this worked is all this research went through an IRB. And the fact of the matter is that the data on this the identity of the participants other than the parents is unknown to the participants in the research. They never directly collect the data and never even see who they are, all right? So they really do not know. On the other hand, you could imagine that some scenario in a nation full of lawyers where in a tape that's buried at the bottom of this, in some recording someplace, somebody might say, there's something that went on and we want to find the truth is, and we think you have it. So there are issues that might potentially come up about this, I suppose, and those will have to be managed as we go forward. So it's not how, it doesn't give you itself transcripts and identify individuals. It doesn't know who's talking. And the system actually is a self-learning system. So it learns the patterns of the mother and the father. It learns, again, it can judge gender, but it generally doesn't, it has lots of unidentified voices, as you can imagine.
But you said you could play it through and actually
You can dig down,
the...
you can dig down, and in the research versions, you can say, I want to know what was said at 3:05 to 3:10 on Thursday, and you can get that transcript, basically, and listen to it. So yes, that is potentially available to people. Yeah.
How many hours of data would you need to collect to get enough sample to make a prediction?
Thank you for that question. I forgot to mention that. So in the study that we looked at with the question is, how much data would you need for this to be essentially an effective screen? How sensitive is it? How reliable is it? So one way that Lena beats everything that's ever been done before is it overwhelms every problem statistically by having so much data. I mean, most of the data the data that Hart and Risley had was 1/4 of 1% or something like that of the waking hours of the children in their study. They made all their estimates from that tiny little piece of data. It was something like that. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. And because it was so expensive to collect this data, nobody ever had very much data on anything. All of a sudden, you have a ton of data. Now, when the study was done by, the study that is in review right now, all the kids had, whatever I said, 6 or 7 samples of data. And so we looked at the issue of if we only used the first sample of data we got on the families, this was tested, what would be the difference in the specificity and reliability of the measure under that condition versus comparing it to all the data, at that kind of a situation where all the data was used. And it wasn't quite as good, but it was only slightly less accurate. So my guess is that you could do this, I mean, it was in the 85 percentile instead of 90 percentile. That was slightly less. It wasn't quite as good, but it was still awfully good. And let's assume that we aren't using the most optimal method right now. There's a second method to analyzing this data that's been already developed by some of the engineers working with the Lena Foundation that comes at it a little differently. It looks like it's already improved the accuracy of the approach. So my guess is, as a screener, we could do a pretty good job with one good 12 to 16 hour sample. But that's based on what we've seen so far. And it remains, all of these things remain to be replicated, proven, and studied by other people, of course. Yeah, Sally.
I have another question. Do you know from the studies of phonemic quality of children with autism from previous groups, what % of children in the groups with ASD have phonemic differences?
And I don't know the answer to that. I would turn to Kim All and say, Kim, answer that question. I don't know. I actually probably shouldn't speculate. It's not a tiny percent. I mean, it's a substantial group, but I don't know if it's 50% or 70%. And I think the problem with those studies is that the ear that's listening to it, okay, is not very attuned. So there are certain things that I think we could all pick up, and parents will report to you frequently, well, my kid makes some sounds that are different. Their pitch is higher, their prosody is different. And those are reliable clinical observations, but the specific characteristics of those and whether they're really unusual or they're really different online, I think are not what we can pick up. And so I don't know the specific answer to your question now.
I was wondering about the question of the richness of the language that the parents are speaking. Is the Lena software able to pick it up like questions versus commands versus repeated words?
No, it can't do any of that. However, it's a great question. I mean, remember, it doesn't understand anything and it doesn't know the meaning of anything. But here's the caveat I'll throw out. There's research going on the ability of the system to predict emotion in speech. Okay? It's again, it may sound exotic. It's a physical problem. So questions have, and you know, intonation changes and things can mark things like questions. But when you can start to predict emotion and things like that, you may be able to develop sensitive measures that give you a general idea of the nature of the interaction. Is it a description? Is it a comment? Is it a directive? Don't do that. I mean, some of these things that have distinctive markers. How fine that will ever go is unknown at this point. But I suspect this problem will be solved by the technology at some general level, and then we'll get a better idea of the quality of differences in interactions. So it's not there yet. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Warren, I have a question with regards to maternal responsivity and autism.
Yeah.
The study the slide that you showed with the graphs.
Yeah.
If I heard you correctly, the maternal responsivity didn't have a significant effect on the children that were ASD, correct?
Well, it did have a significant effect, but its effect was much more muted than the effect with the the other Fragile X kids. And so autism moderated and changed the nature of it. So it helped a little bit, but it didn't do as much as with the kids with Fragile X without autism.
Well, I would be curious to see some further research along the whole line of maternal responsivity and ASD.
Yeah.
I come from years, I'm kind of older, from where we used to think that autism was caused by refrigerator runners. Yeah. So that sort of ruffles my feathers a little bit.
Let me point out, I don't think this has anything to do with some concept like that. I think what this is reflecting is the behavioral differences in the kids and the difficulty there's more behavior management issues, there's more difficulty being in that sort of turn-taking conversation, but it does happen, and it does seem to impact behavior. It's just harder to do it.
Well, and from what I've observed, though, in working with children on the spectrum, is that often they shut out communication, and they become overstimulated.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
a sensitive
exactly.
maternal response sometimes is to be quiet.
Yes, I agree. That makes perfect sense
And
to
I
me.
think it would be a really good study to compare maternal number of words used with the same mother with a normally or typically developing child as compared to an autistic child.
I love the question, because we're looking at this. One of the things we're looking at in our Fragile X study is, I tell you why I like it. We have 12 parents in our study, 13 parents, who have there's a typically developing SIB in the house. And we're looking, we have an analysis underway right now. It's not a big group, but nobody else has this particular example, where we're going to be able to look at the parenting style with the SIB age match, not developmental, we can't do a developmental match, but age matched SIB to the child with Fragile X. And there's a subgroup of kids with autism in that group. And we're going to look at the style difference of the parenting based on that comparison with a typically developing SIB. In the same measurement context exactly. Unfortunately, we've already collected the data, but before we had the Lena device available to us. But we are going to look at that. We also have qualitative data in which parents describe how they parent differently the two children based on the challenges they get. So we're going to do this sort of combination, quantitative differences and qualitative differences that the parents describe in terms of, in essence, what they're trying to do when they parent the problems and things that they do. But I think your point is very well taken. The last thing you want to do is suggest that these are parents who are not doing the best they can do. In fact, these are parents who volunteered to be in this study, and I'm sure they're, frankly, if they're anything, they're misrepresentative probably on the higher end. But they're facing, using these kind of measures, a particularly difficult challenge on these kind of measures. And I think your point, I think your point is very well taken.
Well, I think you can also add to this the studies that have been done that show that parents of children with autism, when you compare them to parents of children with other kinds of disabilities in terms of their social interaction, there are never any differences. You're really talking about differences within a sample here of parents who are more responsive versus less, not atypically, but just individual variations.
That's right. I think
and we would assume those same variations would exist in any population of parents. So we're not talking about atypical parenting, we're just talking about style within typical parenting.
Yeah.
Okay, are there other questions or comments? Yes.
Is there any research coming up for kids like her? Is there any research coming up for kids?
I don't know. I don't have, not in the work that I've been doing. So I can't speak broadly for the field. We can talk afterwards, though. Okay.
I was just wondering if the mothers said that they talked more to their children when they knew that they had the tape recorder.
That's a very good question. So the Lena device it's a little thing like this. It sits there, and I think it does. It probably has some impact very briefly on parent behavior, but it goes on all day long. It doesn't make any noise, and you can't actually see it. You know it's there. And after looking at the range of behavior we get within the same families, up, down, good days, bad days, good days, bad days, I would have to say that I think its impact on behavior is very, very minimal. And that's similar to other kinds of devices like that have been used to record behaviors. People sort of get used to them pretty fast, and they can't fake it very long. So.
Or questions from the group? I think we have probably worn you out, Steve, and filled your time well.
You did.
Thank you very much.
The UC Davis Mind Institute began in 1998 with a promise to find cures for neurodevelopmental disorders. Every day, our physicians and researchers come closer to fulfilling that promise. Their groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, learning disabilities, and other brain disorders is helping children achieve their fullest potential. Please call or visit our website to find out more about current studies, our research team, and upcoming events.
There's a very large scientific literature on this thing called maternal responsivity. Sometimes it's called other things, but it all reflects to parenting style, basically. And that literature is associated with, shows that high maternal responsivity, lots of this kind of turn-taking interaction with children throughout the day by not just parents, but caretakers, teachers. We're talking about young kids, remember, developmentally at least. Leads to enhanced cognitive development, enhanced language development, enhanced social skills, and as I pointed out in an example of the study I was involved in, can lead to better effects of early intervention for kids who do have issues. So it does matter. And so this topic became of greater interest to me because of the effects I saw in my own language intervention research and the work I did with Paul Yoder, and it led me to begin to study this variable called maternal responsivity in a group of families who have Fragile X syndrome. Now, as many of you know, Fragile X syndrome is a neurodevelopmental disorder that is associated with autism. Roughly, depends on the study you look at, somewhere from 20 to 35% of children, mostly males, who have Fragile X syndrome will end up being diagnosed with some stability on the autism spectrum. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that I know many people study here at the Mind Institute and can teach us a lot about autism. It's also a particularly interesting sort of disorder to really examine maternal responsivity in, because maternal responsivity, first of all, potentially may moderate the effects of Fragile X on child development. That is, children who have Fragile X disorder and who come from situations in which cumulatively they receive a very rich, high degree of maternal responsivity, those kids may have higher cognitive levels of development, higher language development, other markers that may be better than on average they might be without that. That's our hypothesis that we want to test, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But on the downside, maternal responsivity may be impacted by some aspects of the mother's behavior. If the mother, of course, is a carrier, the biological mother of Fragile X, there may be greater depression, anxiety. There could be effects on cognitive level of the mother. It may be more difficult for that mother to parent the child in a highly responsive way, consistently at least, on a regular basis. And then, of course, the child's impact itself. It's very difficult to be highly responsive in the way I just described with a child who is very difficult to interact with. We all know that. So if it were otherwise, if maternal responsivity could be done with any kind of kid at some high and easy level, kind of like for the first time inventing a microscope and getting a chance to look through that microscope and see things. And that microscope for this talk has been turned on to autism. And so we're going to talk about a study that is in press now in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disabilities that reports the findings of this initial application of this measurement system. And then I'm going to end up, I'll just title the last part, Serendipity. There's nothing more pleasurable or fun in science than when you have an unexpected discovery. So that'll become at the very end, and I'll whet your appetites for that to hang in here. So the cumulative deficit hypothesis. This is an idea really that children with developmental disabilities, developmental delays, one of the challenges that they face and that we face with them is that over time their experience in life, growing up in the first few years of life and going forward, is one of steadily growing a deficit in terms of not just sometimes their skills, and the way we talk about their skills, but their actual experiences. And that is part of how a developmental disability sort of works back upon itself at times. And so I'm going to talk about that first by letting you look at an old study now, just to make the point. There was a study done on the language experience of only typically developing children. No children in this slide had a developmental delay. In terms of the cumulative language experience that children experience during very early childhood, and how these were all typically developing children. This is a longitudinal study that was done at the University of Kansas, and they actually done the study in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It was published in a paper in Developmental Psychology, a professional journal in 1992, and then a book that I encourage you, if you really want to read an exciting and for anybody, I give this to undergraduates, a paper that describes forces that impact the development of children. The book Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children will be like reading a novel, an exciting one. And it reports the findings of their study with 42 typical children in this country. What was profound in their discovery with these 42 families and their young children was the differences in cumulative experiences that children had in terms of things that aid and support language development, language experience, and in some respects, social emotional development. Those differences were profound enough that they predicted how kids did in school years later. And this really, I think what was important about this study was that it sort of opened up something, a view that people had suspected but didn't have a clear picture of. And that's just how a cumulative effect can work over time in development. The differences between the kids in this study, you couldn't see in just watching a single period of interaction. They all were from intact homes. They all had caring parents. They all were typically developing children. Only if you looked at the experiences they were having cumulatively could you see how different those environments were and how differently that affected, it didn't change them from being to atypical from typical development, but it really affected overall things in their development that were important. And so this led to really the same kind of thinking, naturally, that we might apply to children with developmental disabilities. I will mention to you one law of almost physics that came out of that Hart-Risley study, and that was something about parent talk. And the law is this: if a parent only talks a little to their child, any child, their initiations to the child are likely to be primarily directives. That is, they're oriented in their talk to managing the child's behavior. You need to do this, you need to pick that up, hand that to me, sit down, drink your milk, etc. All parents do that, and all parents do that roughly equally. What is different is this: if a parent talks a lot to their child, a lot more, most of that extra talk will be rich conversation and description and sort of discussion of what's going on and what the child's interested in and what just happened, and all this kind of talk that uses often a much broader vocabulary, much wider range of adjectives, and much more, all sorts of rich language that helps to build a broad base in vocabulary. So this is just one of the findings of their work that was really important and helped us begin to think about how environments can advantage or disadvantage any child. I got interested in the topic of maternal responsivity and maternal responsivity is the concept I'm now going to work into because it's really related to this construct of cumulative deficit. It's a little broader construct, and I was doing a study of the effects of early communication intervention with a colleague, Paul Yoder, in the early 1990s. And in this study, all the children received intervention directly provided to them by a therapist. The parents received no training, and they weren't part of the intervention. It was done in a preschool setting. But we did study the parents' behavior. We measured the construct of maternal responsivity, how responsive they were to their children, several times during the study. And we discovered in this study that the children who received one of the interventions and who also...
This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
introduction. And I take seriously my role as a guinea pig, as it was described today. I realize this is a group that is probably varied as they come, and I hope that I can give a presentation that will be accessible to everybody here. And of course, I'll look forward to questions towards the end of the presentation. And I think I think the best thing to do with a big group like this, it's late in the afternoon, is get started with the darn talk. So, of course, the first thing you always do in a talk is acknowledge people that have contributed. And I'm just pointing out a few of these are my colleagues that are most recently I've been working with, not by any means in my career, but these are the people who have been influential in most of the things that I'm going to talk about today, as well as the sources of support for that work. My talk is going to sort of work its way through several issues down into autism, if you will. We're going to start with some ways about thinking. I'm a developmental psychologist, by the way. I hope that was clear in Sally's. And so I think about development as a cumulative process, and you'll see how that works in my talk. And then we're going to talk about a very, very powerful variable in human development that we call maternal responsivity or parental responsivity, and the role it can play. And then we're going to get into the part of the talk that's really the new part, and maybe new for many of you. We're going to talk about a major advancement in behavioral sciences, the invention of a new type of measure, a new type of lens. Came from homes in which there was a high degree of maternal responsivity, did much, much better than the other children in the study who had the same intervention and did not come from a home with a high degree of this thing called maternal responsivity. The metaphor I use is that in the intervention, we planted a seed. We planted a seed. We worked with the children 20 or 30 minutes a day, several days a week. Not very much time. They then went home to an environment that either watered that seed and provided the nourishment that it needed to grow, or they didn't. Not to a bad situation, just to a situation in which the nourishment that seed, in terms of the skills that we taught, weren't supported in ways that allowed those to grow. That led to a very strong finding in our research of a sort of differential effect that was done by parents who had received no training, no intervention. It was simply the difference in normal parenting. So that intrigued me, and that's really what led me to where this talk is going to go tonight. So maternal responsivity, what is that exactly? This is, I think, I hope a definition that everyone can appreciate. It's healthy, growth-producing relationship with such characteristics as warmth and nutrients and stability for the child and predictability for children about how their environments work and what the rules are and how they're going to be treated. And then it's something else, and that's called contingent responsiveness. That means that when a child says something like, is looking around and they want to find something and there's a cup of water they want to drink, maybe they reach for it and their mom goes, oh, you want the water, here's the water. And it means that literally turn by turn, the child initiates, the adult responds, the child initiates, the adult responds. There are these conversations, and in these conversations that occur all day long at all sorts of weird times, 7 days a week, 60, 52 weeks a year, however many there are, the child is getting this very explicit sort of feedback. Nobody's thinking about this or trying to construct this, but that feedback is teaching them about the world, what things are named, how things are worked, and they're in response to the child's initiations, okay, or things that the child is showing interest in. So that contingent responsiveness turns out to be where the great power of maternal responsivity resides. So you could be a really nice, warm, nurturing parent, but not engage in a lot of contingent responsiveness, those conversations and dialogues with your child, and probably your child won't receive that extra boost that maternal responsivity can make. Now, that's basically the definition. You'll see variations on that in the literature. Why does it matter? So there